Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We are still about to start the 2037 offseason. Just have a couple of housekeeping items and follow up items we want to talk about in this episode. And then hopefully we will get this voyage into what will be an interesting offseason started. Do appreciate all of the thoughts and feedback that many of you have shared over the last several episodes as far as what we should potentially do in international amateur free agency, what we should potentially do with our catching situation, with Andres Medina headed to free agency, and Walt Miller being a guy who is up for arbitration this year. Also appreciate all the thoughts on Joe Edwards and Bobby Bolig and which direction we should go with some of the players that we may be moving on from. So the input is always helpful to me, but this is one off season where I still don't honestly have a real strong opinion what I want to do. I think ultimately figuring out whether or not we're going to try to bring back Medina is the linchpin item of this offseason, because if we decide to bring back Medina, then when we are thinking about our arbitration eligible players, we probably don't bring back Walt Miller at close to $5 million a year to be a backup catcher with the amount of money we would need to be paying for Medina. And you can see here that we've made some initial thoughts on the players that we're definitely going to try to bring back in arbitration and those who we aren't. Tyreek Hardage is still young and not that expensive and good defensively. But I do have to be honest with the fact that he's been in the majors for 4 seasons now, and he's never once been an average offensive player. So he is a 4th or 5th outfielder. Now, we like the fact that he's got speed. We like the fact he's good defensively. We like the fact that he's got some positive personality traits, particularly the high leadership. But do we really want to be spending $2 million a year on a 5th outfielder? I'm not 100% confident, so we haven't made an offer to him yet. I've talked about Joe Edwards a lot, and many of you have commented on him. The $8 million number for him next year, if he's a below average offensive player like he was this year, it's a bad salary. If he is a well above average offensive player like he was the previous 2 years, it's fine. And a lot will depend on whether or not we can trade away Bobby Bolig. The issue is that Bolig is a guy at this point who almost has negative trade value if we don't want to end up retaining a good chunk of his contract, which kind of defeats the purpose of trying to get that money off the books. Then we're probably going to have to include some good players with him to move Bolig. So that is part of the reason why I'm a little more receptive to potentially moving Edwards, because he still has decent trade value and would take a decent amount of money off the books. We've talked about Miller. If we go after Medina, then we probably try to trade Miller before arbitration. If we decide to move on from Medina, then we almost certainly bring Miller back to potentially be our starter. Pat Mems, coming off of a serious injury and being 32 years old and wrecked and being in line for about $8 million, is likely a guy that we'll move on from, but I haven't decided that one way or another yet. And then Isidro Ochoa is kind of an interesting case. Talked a couple of episodes ago about how he's our 5th starter now and probably not a guy that we're going to make a long-term commitment to. When I was looking at his arbitration number, around $2.8 million, certainly kind of okay paying that number to him as a 5th starter. But he's willing to sign an 8-year contract for us at an average of a little over $6 million a year, and he's willing to come in at numbers for the next 3 years, his arbitration seasons, that are pretty materially below, 20-ish% below where we think his arbitration numbers are going to be right now. So from that perspective, he's given us a decent discount on his arbitration years. The issue is then he wants to be paid about $8 million a year for the next 5 years. We would have the opportunity to get out of those final years with what he proposes. So I've been a little intrigued by this, but when I try to be somewhat objective about it and look at what Ochoa has done over the course of his major league career, he has been a very average-ish major league starter. And there is a part of me that feels like, as much as I like to be loyal to my players and kind of have them with my team as long as possible, we've now devoted big money to Barajas, Shazier, and Estrada. Mendoza is going to be very cheap and manageable the next couple years and then start making big money. I kind of feel like a number 5 starter at $7 to $8 million a year is probably a luxury that the Buffalo Wings cannot afford. So I think I am inclined to just make an offer to Ochoa to bring him back next year at a $2.5 million, $2.6 million kind of number. Have him as our number 5 starter next year, and continue on the path to potentially parting ways with him when he hits free agency, or conceivably if over the next couple of years, while he's still arbitration eligible, he just gets a little too expensive for us for what he is. So those are the guys that I haven't made decisions on yet. Elvin Jimenez, Juan Reynoso, Yohane Varejo, and Lauren Walborn will all be back with us next year in our bullpen, assuming the arbitration offers we've made are accepted. And Steve Anderson at shortstop and Tim Gaglia in the mix for a center field spot are 2 other guys that at this point I have already made arbitration offers to and intend to bring back. And before we take a deeper dive into what our minor league system looks like right now, because that certainly will inform some of the decisions that we're going to make, I'm just going to pronounce it phonetically, Prisful. Requested that we take a look at the Philadelphia team that upended us in the playoffs, had the number 1 offense in the National League, and just went on a dominant run to the World Series, to take a look at their offense. And just looking at this right here, you can see they had some players who had incredible seasons. Their first baseman, Jerry Miller, doesn't, to me, have a profile that suggests he's a .338 hitter. The 18 homers and the 92 ribbies I can kind of see. Probably got a bit lucky, as you can tell, with a .381 BABIP this year, but he had a really nice and productive year for them. Yoichi Kubota looks like a guy who could certainly win an MVP award. Been talking in the past about how I think this could be Deshaun Seifu's year, given that we're a 102-win team, and he had a 7.1 WAR. The 2 other guys in the National League who had WARs over 7 were both on losing teams. But Kubota, who led the league in runs, home runs, ribbies, slugging percentage, OPS, and WRC+, while also playing for a 92-win team, does certainly look like a guy who could certainly get some MVP votes. And he has been kind of that rare import from Japan who was immediately an impact player. 41 homers and 118 ribbies a year ago with a 141 WRC+, and then that incredible 174 WRC+ this year. He signed a 4-year deal at $27.2 million a year, so he's halfway through that contract. off to a really nice start in the majors there. Some of you have commented on this before that we should just go looking at the Phillies for our next catcher because that's where we traded for both Medina and Miller over the last half decade. Part of the reason, though, that they've been willing to trade away good catchers, borderline, very good catchers in the case of Medina, is that they knew they had Luis Ortega in their organization. And he is probably the best catcher in baseball, a well above average bat with great home run power and great ability to draw walks. And he's also an above average defensive catcher at 38, 39, and 36 homers these past 3 seasons. 142 WRC plus this past year was the worst figure that he's had in these first 3 full years of his in the major leagues. Jake Spring, left-handed hitting, 31-year-old right fielder, 283 average, 29 homers, 87 ribbies, 130 WRC plus. So the middle of that Philadelphia order, especially the 3, 4, and 5 spots, is just a not quite a murderer's row, but some very effective offensive players. Eric Mossberger, the DH, 31-year-old, has a pretty nice hitting profile. Looks like they picked him up in a trade with the White Sox right before the trade deadline. Had a 113 WRC plus for them after he came over, so he wasn't dominant with them, but good presence in the clubhouse, and he helped them win a World Series title. So those are kind of the cornerstones of that offense from Philadelphia that was dominant in the National League. You can see they led the National League in runs scored, batting average, on-base percentage, OPS, batting WAR, WOBA, second in homers, third in stolen bases. Their pitching staff was pretty mediocre, but they battered people with that offense throughout the playoffs and ended up riding that offense to a World Series title. And one final thing that I wanted to do before we really move into the offseason in earnest was a review of our farm system. Touched on a few of the players who are closer to majors in the last few episodes, but really kind of want to do the annual deep dive here. You can see that with the promotions this past season of Mendoza, who is likely to be Rookie of the Year, and then Joe Gallagher, who very well could be runner-up for Rookie of the Year. Our minor league system has regressed a bit to being very middle of the pack, 18th out of 32 teams. That said, we've still got some prospects that aren't far away. Eric Barbarito is the top prospect in our system now at number 42. He split the year between Utica and Albany, 8-4 with a 3.45 ERA in Utica, 6-4 with a 3.20 ERA in Albany. First round pick drafted in 2033, so 4 years ago at this point. Has pretty steadily moved up through our organization. Don't think he's ever going to be an ace, but certainly think that he could be a 4th or 5th starter. He throws pretty hard, good personality in the clubhouse. Conceivably, if we do move on from Ochoa over the next couple of seasons, he could certainly fill a role at the back end of our rotation. Don't think he's quite on the same level as a Shazier or a Mendoza in terms of some of the guys that we have drafted and developed over the past few years, but still looks like he could be a useful major leaguer. Another guy named Mendoza, not our starting pitcher, is David Mendoza, first baseman, number 44 prospect in baseball, has been on the interstate 2 consecutive years in rookie ball, has shown a little bit of pop with 8 homers a year ago and then 10 homers and 158 at-bats this year. Question for him is whether he's going to ever be able to make enough contact and not strike out at an insane amount to be a productive player. Struck out a ridiculous 96 times in 158 bats in rookie ball this year. So some brutal metrics there. Guadalupe Amezcua, number 52 prospect in baseball, another scouting discovery, started to put it together a little bit this year. His third trip through rookie ball, 207 average, 12 homers. Given that he's 21 years old, we'll certainly end up promoting him to A ball next year with that 133 WRC plus. Seems like he is ready for a new challenge. We look at his ratings compared to the FSL and certainly worried about his ability to make contact and avoid strikeouts, but his gap power, his home run power, and his eye suggests that while he's probably not going to be dominant this coming season, he shouldn't be completely overwhelmed either. So those three are on paper the top three prospects in our system. Jorge Berrios was an international free agent signing 5 years ago, and we've been kind of steadily promoting him, even though his bat hasn't really necessarily earned him those promotions. You can see he had a .192 in rookie ball a couple seasons ago, .219 in Class A ball a year ago, and then .204 in AA this year. But he does have some pop in the bat with 17 homers. Looks like he's a bit above average defensively. Feel like he is a guy who in the next few years could end up being a pretty respectable backup catcher for us. Don't think he's quite ready to do that next year. In a worst case scenario where we decided to move on from Medina and give Miller the job, I think we've got other guys in the organization who we would look at as a backup catcher before Berrios, but could he be a September call-up next year? Quite possibly. It's just a matter of hopefully his bat developing a little more than it has. Devin Cabuto, first-round pitcher picked in 2035, split the year between rookie ball and A ball, was 2-5 with a 5.71 in ERA in rookie ball, but just kind of felt like it was time to try him somewhere else. And he was somewhat more successful in A ball, where he went 4-0 with a 4.04 ERA. Question is how good his stuff is going to be. Looks like he's only going to be a 3-pitch guy. And right now those 3 pitches are pretty average. If they get a little better, he could be effective at the major league level. He's also got to improve his control, combined for 61 walks this year in 87 2/3 innings pitched. So I'd say he's somewhat similar to Barbarito. I don't think he's going to be a front of the rotation type of guy, but could be a useful pitcher for us down the line. Josh Nagy, another first-round pitcher that we picked in recent years as we're trying to bolster this pitching staff. And he was 4-4 this year in rookie ball with a 5.23 ERA. He turned 19, I guess, very early in the rookie ball season for us. Think that he's a guy who, in a best case scenario, can be more than a back end starter like the other guys that we've been talking about. Has a long way to go. Likely will end up in A ball at some point next year, like some of the personality traits, and he still seems to be a guy who, if his fastball, sinker, and cutter all develop the way that we think they can, the only question is going to be, can he get the ball over the plate consistently? Struggled with that this year, as many young pitchers do, with 55 walks allowed in 57 innings, but he did strike out 90, so there are some positives and some negatives in Mr. Nagy. 3 final prospects that we have who are also in the top 200. Jim Lance, second-round pitcher picked in 2036, 4-3 with a 6.16 ERA in rookie ball this year at the age of 19. We're just, as you can tell by the number of pitchers that we've talked about already, and if you've watched previous seasons and previous episodes, the number of kind of pitchers we've picked in the top 5 rounds of the draft over the past 5 or 6 seasons, trying to just roll the dice as many times as we can with some pitchers and hope that a few of them hit. If Lance completely develops to the top of his potential, he could be useful. David Espinoza is a guy who we finally called up at the end of this past season. Was not great in Albany, 11-7, but a 5.37 ERA. But he was pretty effective in the 16 innings that he pitched in the majors. He's another guy who could end up taking over in the coming years as a fifth starter for Ochoa, or potentially work out of the bullpen for us. Do like the fact that he is a lefty, which we've been struggling to kind of get a third or fourth lefty that we like out of the bullpen for the last couple of years, and feel that this upcoming season, with Walborn and Valise both already signed, if we add Espinoza into the mix as a reliever, that'll give us a third lefty arm out of the bullpen that we are reasonably comfortable with. And the final top 200 prospect we have is Mike Coleman, pitcher, lefty, who was drafted in the 3rd round in 2035. Split this past year between rookie ball and A ball, 5-2 with a 2.33 ERA in rookie ball before we promoted him up to A ball, where he went 4-1 with a 4.50 ERA. Advanced metrics still show that he was a bit above average at that level. Another guy who, if that changeup does not develop, probably a fifth starter or maybe a reliever at the major league level, but a left-handed arm that could be useful to us a few years down the line. So we've kind of pivoted the prospects a bit over the last few years. 4 or 5 years ago, we were somewhat top-heavy in terms of position player prospects, and with the focus on drafting pitchers with some level of frequency over these last 4 or 5 drafts, you can see that we've got a decent number of solid starting pitching prospects in the organization. Now, I don't think we have an ace. I don't even think we necessarily have a number 2 starter among any of them, but should have multiple players who can ultimately be contributors on a major league roster, and guys who can be a 4th or 5th starter for us, or a nice arm out of the bullpen for an inexpensive price, are certainly an asset that team with the budgetary constraints that we have in the Buffalo Wings should find to be valuable resources down the line. And outside of those 9 top 200 prospects, a number of other interesting prospects in our system, we're just going to focus on the 3 that are closest to the majors. One is Ben Elmquist, who made it up to the majors at the end of the year. We talked about him, obviously, when we did our season review. Having Elmquist around is part of the reason that I'm not totally sure what I want to do with Tyreek Hardage, because between Gaglia and Elmquist, we've got a left-handed hitting and a right-handed hitting center fielder who are both pretty solid defensively. I think we probably do end up ultimately bringing Hardage back next year, but I think playing time for Hardage is going to get tough to come by, and he really seems like he is settling in, as I said, as a 4th or maybe even more accurately a 5th outfielder, whereas I still think there's potential for Elmquist in particular, and possibly Gaglia, to be everyday players for us. Teagan Tiley is a guy who was our 1st-round draft pick back in 2031, and had a full year in Albany this season, his 2nd straight full year there. He was a below-average offensive player in 2036, slightly above average this season. Think he can be a useful major league player. He's competent defensively. Looks like he can ultimately be competent offensively. Think in a perfect world, he is a utility infielder for us. Can't really play the outfield with that brutal 20 range, so that's the reason that He's basically only trained up at all of the infield positions, but feel like he is a useful guy. I don't know whether he's ever going to be a everyday starter for us, particular given his fragility, but feel like he could be a pretty useful player off the bench for us for several years to come, hopefully. And then last guy we'll touch upon is Steve Duncan, a 22-year-old who was a fourth-round draft pick out of Dallas Baptist in 2036. Split last year between rookie ball and A ball, and split this year between high A ball and double A ball. 301 with 8 homers in high A ball. Struggled a bit in double A Utica, where he hit just 237 and 253 at-bats. Not a big-time prospect, but another guy who looks like he could be a useful major league player. I think that his bat overall could be slightly above average, possibly. He's a left-handed hitter. He's got a little bit of speed. He's not a particularly good outfielder, but he's at least got decent range to track some things down. So a guy who could end up in a platoon with us in a perfect world, or maybe as a fourth or fifth outfielder down the line. Not a game-changing prospect, but still somebody who we think could be useful up in Buffalo in the next few seasons. So as we really prepare to get ready to jump into the off season, the big decisions are kind of right here in front of us on our salary page. Do we want to bring Medina back as our catcher next year at a big number? And if so, how do we free up the cash to bring him back? We've talked about potentially moving on from Mems. We've talked about potentially moving on from Edwards. We've even talked about potentially moving on from Walt Miller if we do decide to try to bring Medina back. But the most obvious solution would be to move on from Bobby Bolig, who's due an average of $17.5 million a year over these next 4 seasons before those team options are available. And Bolig coming off of a still above average offensive season, but he's 30 years old now. He's fragile, and his ratings are beginning to regress a bit. So in a perfect world, as I think I've noted in the past, and I know some of you have also noted in the comments, with the young left-handed hitter Carranza and the left-handed hitting Mike Heiner, we can probably have 2 bats that are pretty similar production-wise at first base and corner outfield as Bolig at a fraction of the price that we're paying for Bolig. So the conceptual move of moving on from Bolig, I understand and agree with, and I'm entirely on board with. The issue is that with the money that he is owed, Bobby Bolig is not viewed particularly attractively by the teams out there. You can see if we shop him, there is nobody who is offering anything for him in a trade unless we start retaining some of his money. And if we're willing to retain half of his money, which again, or not again, but which to me somewhat defeats the purpose of potentially moving on from him, to be spending $7.5, $8.5, $9 million on him for the next few years, the next 4 seasons, when he won't even be on our roster, is a tough pill for us to potentially swallow as a team that has some salary limitations. You can see keeping 50% of his salary at least gives us some options to think about. But what I think I'm ultimately going to need to do if I do decide that I want to get Bolig off the books is probably get as little back in return for him as possible, and maybe include a prospect or two, perhaps even one of those starting pitching prospects we were talking about, who I think is likely only a 5th starter, but may have a little bit of value since the AI does tend to like to accumulate starting pitchers and assign some value to them. To me, the question is how much I have to include with Bolig to get him off the books. I agree that it's a contract that, although I was pretty excited when we signed him to it, and he's been a very productive player for us over the course of his 5 years in Buffalo. A 122 WRC plus over 5 seasons is very productive. He's been an incredibly important player, very good on the base paths, very productive offensively, and he's had some really big hits for us on the way to a couple of World Series championships, and he was the NLCS MVP in 2034 when we won our first title. He's been an all-star for us a couple of times also, so I'm really happy with the production that we've gotten out of him of his first 5 years in Buffalo, but at 30, being fragile, and with his ratings beginning to regress a bit, although the contract hasn't hurt us yet, I think there's potential that it will hurt us somewhat significantly in the next few years. And just based on what we've seen in terms of the limited, or more accurately, non-existent demand for him if we were not to retain a chunk of his contract, I think other teams kind of view his future and his future value as somewhat questionable as well. So I'd like to move on from him. Am I going to give up the top two prospects in our organization to move on from him? Probably not. But if we can craft a deal where we keep less than 20% of his salary and we don't have to give up a really big-time prospect, that's kind of the deal that I think I'm going to be looking for to potentially get him off the books. And if we do get a big chunk of his money off the books, that kind of puts us in a position where we could potentially bring back Mr. Medina next year. Nothing has changed since we haven't moved forward in terms of what he's looking for. $20.24 million a year over 5 years, with some optionality in his favor. Player opt out after 3, player option year 5, and a no trade clause. So we can likely get him for less than that, but we're getting to the point where we kind of have to make a decision on what we're going to do with Mr. Medina. And the only real path to be able to afford to even make a decision on Mr. Medina is going to be to trade away Bolig, or to potentially refuse the option on Mems, maybe trade him away, refuse the option on Miller, maybe trade him away. That probably gets us where we need to be also. And then a final option to mix in there is whether we trade away Joe Edwards. We talked about this with him. If he has the year he has last year, he's overvalued at around $8 million. If he plays the way he played previous seasons, he's, I don't want to say a huge value at $8 million, but he's definitely some value if he's putting up a 130 WRC plus at that kind of number. That would be pretty good value if he put up a 130 WRC plus, I'll be honest with you. But he is a guy who does still have some trade value. So if we decide we want to tweak the roster a little more, maybe try to find a catcher, try to find a really good defensive second baseman, Edwards is a guy that at least has some trade value. And that also means that if we're trying to get rid of Bolig, if we include a guy like Edwards, that all of a sudden probably means that we need to keep a lot less of Mr. Bolig's salary, since although Bolig is not particularly attractive to other teams, Edwards certainly is. So I can see a scenario where the two of them go together in a deal to clear a ton of salary space for next year. I'm leaning towards moving on from Mems. Miller, a lot depends what we decide to do with Medina, but you could see a scenario where we're clearing $35-40 million off the books, which would put us in a position to be significant players in free agency if we wanted to. Michael Harris certainly heads the list of potential free agents. If we made all those kind of moves that I was talking about, he's a guy who we could afford. I don't think that a wrecked 36-year-old is the right path for us to go, but he has certainly had an incredible career at this point. Still looks like a pretty productive offensive player, still has pretty good speed. But that's not a direction that we would go. And then you can see here that Funky Cole Medina is viewed as the one of the top handful of prospects available. The catcher ability is incredible. It's not the cheat code that it was in OOTP previous versions, particularly 22, maybe even 21, a little bit last year. But catcher ability is still important. He's got some great personality traits, and he ultimately did develop into kind of close to what we thought he could. I think at one point when we first picked him as an international amateur free agent, the thought was his home run power and his eye could both be a bit better than they look like they are today. The contact, I think, kind of developed to where we thought it could be, but felt like he could be a productive offensive player with a great glove, and he really finally lived up to that these last couple of years with a 125 WRC plus and a 110 WRC plus, while also playing good defense. Going back through the ratings just to see what we thought he could be. October of 23 when he first came out, before we signed him in 2024. So I guess more appropriate to kind of see what he looked like in January of 24, right before we brought him on board. And actually we thought he could be even better. 65 contact, 60 home run power, 55 eye. Those numbers clearly trended in a less favorable direction over time. Hasn't reached the true heights that we thought he could, but still a pretty good player. Kyle Tucker, a wrecked 40-year-old, probably not the guy we're going to go after. Daniel Maldonado, an Iron Man catcher as opposed to the durable of Medina, a little bit younger. Looks like he might have a better bat, but honestly with that average-ish defense, I think I would prefer Medina at, $8 to $10 million a year less than Maldonado. And then Dan Mathiowicz, a first baseman. Don't see a real need to pursue somebody like him. So among the players who are potential free agents, if we were going to go after any of these top 5 guys, I think it's our guy, Medina. The top 5 free agents among position players. Can see that Dylan Carlson, who hit a $171 for us this year, is among a large group of 3-star potential players who are out there. A couple other catchers as well. Campbell Smithwick, the number for him is $17 million. Not as good defensively or as good offensively as Medina. Gabriel Moreno, 37 years old, bad defensively and probably not as good defensively as Medina. He's not looking for a ton of money. Luis Lemus, 30-year-old, has that 70 catcher ability, but just can't hit. Hit a $188 this past year. Has been a well below average offensive player. He's looking for $9 million. And then Masato Chilcutt, 31-year-old, bit above average. Defensively, nothing exciting. Offensively, and Chilcutt's looking for 11.15 million. So as I look at these catchers who could be options for us on the free agent market, I don't hate Medina. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do. As I've mentioned in the comments, I've vacillated back and forth on this over the past several days. Every time someone leaves me a comment, if they're pro Medina, I come out thinking, yeah, I need to go after Medina. And then if I get a anti-Medina comment, he's too expensive for what he is, I kind of like, yeah, they're right. So to me, it's not an obvious decision what to do, but it's ultimately going to be a pivotal decision for us, because if we do decide to bring him back, it's going to cost us some money. But when I'm looking at the other catchers who are available on the market, I do kind of feel like if we could sign Medina for 16, 17 million average with a little more team optionality built into a contract, it's probably not a horrible deal. And it would certainly help anchor our pitching staff. Taking a look at the potential pitchers are available, our closer Chris Bloomquist is just looking for stupid money. And you can see there's a few other closers and relievers who are among the more high overall and high potential prospects that are available out there on the free agent market. Looking at starting pitchers, pretty slim pickings. We only have, according to our scout, one guy who's even a 3-star starter out there, Melvin Amador. Looks like he could be a useful pitcher, lefty from St. Louis, looking for close to 20 million. And then after that, there's kind of a bunch of guys who are 4th and 5th starters, but particularly if we do end up bringing Ochoa back, we don't really need to chase after a starting pitcher, and we're in a position where we might really only need to do one reliever. So figuring out catcher is kind of the big thing we need to do this offseason. Ultimately, we're going to need to either find a closer or promote one of our relievers to be a closer, and we could ultimately be looking for some help in the infield if we move on from Edwards particularly, and in the outfield if we're able to piece a trade together for Bolig. But I think the main things that I'm going to be trying to figure out between now and our next episode is, can I craft a deal to get Bolig's salary off the books without giving up tons of top prospects to do it? And then if I am able to craft a deal to get Bolig off of the books, do we use the money that we're saving by moving on from Mr. Bolig to bring Medina back, or do we do something else with it? And I think the answers to those two questions will go a long way towards determining what we end up trying to do this offseason, and whether this roster 4 or 5 months from now, when we're getting ready for the 2038 season, looks very similar to the way that it looks today, or perhaps has more significant turnover than we've typically had in previous off seasons. And we'll finally start making some of those decisions in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.